Namaste and a good afternoon to those of you watching from the UK, a good evening to those of you in India. My name is Lakshmi Kaul and I head up the UK wing of Confederation of Indian Industry. At the outset, may I offer you a warm welcome on behalf of Infosys and the Consulate General of India, Birmingham, who are co-partnering in presenting to you this very, very timely and important discussion today with very, very esteemed guests as panelists. So without further ado, I would like to lay out the template of what we're going to do. The topic of today's discussion is post-pandemic challenges, the new normal and evolving scenarios in healthcare. The pandemic is still upon us, and it's vitally important that we not only overcome this pandemic, but prepare ourselves for anything that is going to be upon us in future. So today's discussion this evolves around a couple of broad contours. So one is, what are the various challenges faced by the healthcare fraternity, the various stakeholders, including the government, the pharma, the hospital systems, and the consumers or the members of public. The number two that we're going to discuss is, after the pandemic, hopefully, which is very, very soon, how will the COVID-19 transform global health and development? Because there's a lot of pressure on infrastructure, there's a lot of pressure on delivering public healthcare systems, there's a lot of pressure on having advanced medical systems. MedTech has become the new normal. How do you utilize technology and enable greater outreach, access, and facilitation of cutting-edge research in dealing with this wretched and dreaded pandemic, and hopefully no more pandemics in future, but then who knows. So before I introduce my panelists to you, we have our own Infosys's own Roshan Shetty, who heads the healthcare, life sciences and insurance for EMEA, who I would like to invite to offer his opening remarks and set the context of what we are discussing today. And then I will introduce the panel with you. Thank you. Roshan, could I invite you to offer your remarks, please?
Thanks, Lakshmi. Good afternoon, everyone. Healthcare ecosystem, be it the government, the pharmaceutical company, the hospital systems, the payers, or the consumers themselves, have actually gone through a very difficult period during the pandemic. Everyone has actually done their best in order to kind of deliver whatever they could actually deliver. And we have seen some heroic attempts in that. But the new normal of healthcare is going to be nothing similar to what we have actually seen or left behind as normal so far. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, the challenges that actually were posed to the pandemic were something that they had never seen. It was a test for the value chain that they operate in, right from manufacturing to supply chain, and is actually causing them to change their business model and their processes. Governments, even in taking small decisions, they have to actually look at the pros and cons just to make sure that any of the decisions that they take are in line with the welfare of their citizens and the safety of their citizens. The healthcare systems per se have been under a lot of stress, to the point that we have actually seen that there is a point of frustration as well as a total fatigue within that segment. We look at actually the researchers and the academic experts. They had to actually look at different ways in which they could continue with the research and the publications. Moreover, everyone in the planet went through a very difficult phase during the havocs created by the virus, both from a perspective of actually physical and emotional and financial kind of stress that they were actually going through. Today, we have amongst us an esteemed panel of speakers coming from different spectrums to share their views and their insights in terms of what the new healthcare ecosystem will look like in the post-pandemic scenario. I invite you all to kind of enjoy the session and to learn as much as possible through the insights these esteemed speakers have.
Thank you, Roshan. Indeed, we have a very illustrious group of people joining us today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of them. I would like to once again offer our very special thanks to Dr. Shashank Vikram, the Consul General of India, Birmingham, who's joining us on the panel and whose support has been quite incredible in organizing today's session. And there is a bit of history there. The Consul General of India in Birmingham have, for the last 2 years, been organizing a very landmark healthcare conference. So, Dr. Vikram, please welcome. We also have on the panel Dr. Karamjit Singh CBE, who is the chairman of University Hospitals of Leicester NHS Trust. Welcome, Karamjit. And we have Dr. David Champeaux, who is the Chief Growth Officer for Cherish Health. Welcome, David. We're also joined by Professor KK Cheng, who is the Director of the Institute of Applied Health Research at the University of Birmingham. And finally, we also have Dr. Kapil Yadav joining us all the way from India. He is the additional professor in Center for Community Medicine at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Quite a renowned, place. It's almost a landmark organization of research and healthcare facilitation. A warm welcome to all my panelists. So the discussion today is about the post-pandemic challenges. Though I mean the dilemma is that we're still in the midst of a pandemic. It's not over yet, and we're looking at the contours of what the new normal and what are the evolving scenarios in healthcare. So the first question is, within the India-UK healthcare story, we know that there is so much interdependence, there is so much interconnectivity, whether it is the vaccines, whether it is the paracetamol, delivery from from India to UK, and whether it is healthcare professionals. So, Dr. Vikram, I'd like to actually turn to you and almost ask you to help us understand the context of these, partnerships on healthcare and collaborations. How does working together and pooling of resources work within the India UK corridor? Dr. Vikram, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And at the outset, let me thank Infosys for organizing this webinar today. And also all the eminent panelists who are there. A very good afternoon to all of you. And I would say that while I think the context of the webinar today is post-pandemic, but actually post-pandemic is something which we all are hoping for. We are definitely in the, what I should say, and I would like to believe at the final stages of the pandemic. And after that, I'm sure across the world, we will have set treatment protocols, vaccines will evolve and come, and it will become one of the many diseases which we have, but not a pandemic anymore. But as of today, I would say, when we talk about the partnership between the healthcare system of countries, one has to see that, in the living memory, this is for the first time that entire world has faced a pandemic, a health emergency, which has started from one corner, and then we saw it went to other corner. In the beginning, people were saying, oh, it will have more effect in the developing countries. Then we started seeing that we might distinguish between people, but pandemic simply doesn't distinguish much. You might be in a rich country or you might be in a poor country, but when the virus came, it affected people all across the globe. So I think one very important thing which comes to the fore in this, that, we are more interconnected than we imagine. So we should not live in worlds where we think that the security at the gate is enough. It is not enough. You might be in an atmosphere which is very different from somebody who is living in, let us say, India, or somebody who is living in Russia, or somebody who is living in Philippines, or any other corner of the world, when it comes to the kind of work you are doing in environment you are moving in. But when it comes to this kind of challenge, you have a common challenge. So if there is a common challenge and we want to evolve a common strategy or a common way to combat it, then we have to also see that the lessons which we have learned are equally shared, and the solutions which we come up with, they are also equally shared. They are also, when the challenge is common and we want to see a global action on this, then the remedy also has to be made available to the people and systems across the world. And that is why, your question is very pertinent. I think collaboration of healthcare systems across the world is very important. And with this pandemic, I think all of us have been on a learning curve. With the beginning of the pandemic itself, India, it is well known as the pharmacy of the world, and true to its, I would say, image, in spite of the fact that we were ourselves reeling with the pandemic, and we have 17% of world's population to look after. India, from the very beginning, was able to supply medicine across the world, whether it was paracetamol or whether it was hydroxychloroquine. Over 150 countries received medicine from India. Many of them received it as grant. And when we came to the second phase of it, and when we were talking about India-UK collaboration, so one of the most shining example in this is the vaccine itself, the Oxford Serum Institute of India vaccine, which came up. And as soon as it was approved, we saw that India not only started the largest vaccination program in the world, but under the direction of the Honorable Prime Minister, we have also been helping countries around the world. The vaccine has been made available not only on commercial terms, but has also been given out as grants to not only to our own neighborhood, but also to countries in Africa and as far as South America it has gone. And I don't know, maybe some of you might have noticed that yesterday itself in the United Nations, India has announced that we are going to give 200,000 doses of vaccine free of cost to the UN peacekeepers. So this we are able to do because we have the capacity to manufacture vaccines. Similarly, I think when we look at different countries, there are different strength points which need to be identified. This has been a learning curve. So I am sure that in different kind of countries, we have come up with different kind of things which have worked. These need to be pulled together. Then these need to be connected so that there is a seamless flow from one health system to the other. And thirdly, I think that since the disease does not make any distinction, it would be wrong on our part to make distinction between two humans. At the end of the day, as I will I will say that as our Prime Minister often quotes that Vasudev Kutumbakam is what we live by. It is that entire word is a family. And that is what I think is the need of the hour for everybody to learn. And with regard to India, UK, as I said, see, vaccination was one thing, very important thing in that there was research which was based in UK. And then there was a production capacity which we have in India. Similarly, we see there are so many complementary factors exist between the health systems of the two countries. Like NHS itself, I would say, is one of the best systems. And we saw that how, with what dedication the NHS worked during this pandemic. And there is a lot which we can learn from there to put it in our own public healthcare system. Similarly, companies like Infosys, which are working in IT sector and have so many digital solutions in healthcare. So that is there. And between India and UK, when it comes to healthcare, I think the biggest strength is the physicians and our healthcare professionals of Indian origin, who basically form a kind of a backbone of healthcare system in this country. And I think many of them who have studied back from India and those who have not studied still have a very strong relationship, I would say, back home with institutions, with their own colleagues and friends. And I would say while we are talking, there might be many of them working on ground to actually strengthen the healthcare collaboration. Last, I will just add that, Brexit has happened and India and Britain today are talking very closely when it comes to trade, commercial, health, and different matters. And in days to come, I'm sure that we are also going to see several initiatives between the two governments. And as we go forward, we are going to see more announcements. Thank you.
Quite right. Thank you, Dr. Vikram. And we are very, very hopeful that, in the days to come, we do see the concretization of this great relationship that UK and India share via the Enhanced Trade Partnership Agreement. you've made some very, very pertinent points, and thank you very much for very, very detailed, sort of, yet succinct remarks. We are in the midst of a health emergency. It's unprecedented, and any crisis, demands a response. And quite rightly pointed out, Dr. Vikram, that we have common challenges, and we have a shared responsibility to respond to these challenges posed by this emergency. We hope that there isn't another. We're still hopeful that we are going to cope with this very, very soon. But the solutions are also in being together in that response. And India is almost, I'm very proud to say, that is taking that leadership role in showing that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and saying that we do care for not just our neighbors but for the world, and we'll be there standing ready to help. And the UK is exactly demonstrated that in many ways, that we do have the research capability, we do have the ability to respond to the crisis. And what a good example that you've quoted, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. um, the crisis, response. Thank you. I will now turn to Karamjit. And, Karamjit, hospital systems have been very, very deeply pressured. And any crisis response comes, the test is the hospital systems, how they adapt. So what are your key takeaways in terms of what have we learned in our response to this crisis via the hospital systems? Karamjit, please.
Right. Thank you, and hello to listeners and viewers. I'm chairman of the fifth largest NHS trust in the UK. We employ 16,500 staff, and we cover a population of 1.2 million. Very diverse population, and as Consul General has mentioned, particularly in our context, we have a very large community of Indian origin, and we also have many clinicians and nurses of Indian origin. I think there are a number of issues, if I can respond, Lakshmi, to your question. I think the first thing I'd say is I think we're likely to be living with COVID variants for some time, and I think this will be a factor for next winter. This may be an endemic issue rather than a pandemic levels, but I think we have to think about this being a long-term issue. I think the immediate challenge for us is that the knock-on effects of this pandemic has been that it has created a backlog of elective operations, of operations in other illnesses that we would have undertaken. And I think this will take a long time to address. And the impact on population health also is an issue to take into consideration. I think the pandemic has exposed the workforce gaps we have across the NHS, particularly in nursing. And I think even with our long-term plan, I think these will not be addressed for at least 3 or 4 years. And I think that if you think that, for example, we had the Nightingale hospitals, the emergency response hospitals being established, the biggest constraint was staffing. We also found, and my observation is in my own organisation and elsewhere, that in many cases, NHS building infrastructure did not easily support infection prevention practices that were needed during the pandemic. And I think that building design in the future will need to reflect this. I think that the other thing we found was that we need to commission more intensive care unit capacity with skilled staff. That has been a critical issue because we found that very ill people have come into hospitals, and we've found hospitals finding difficulty to cope with that demand. I think a longer term challenge now is that if you remember that all our staff have been working non-stop for the last 11 months, staff will need time to rest and recover from this. And I think this is an issue of physical and also mental health issues. And I think this will be a long-term issue that will continue. I think that one of the positive issues that have come out in this pandemic has been that both in my organization and elsewhere, we've seen how multidisciplinary clinical teams have come together and they've made rapid innovations. But that has only happened where you've had the nature and style of the senior leadership has allowed this to facilitate, and you've had the appropriate oversight of governance. I think what we've also seen, and we're very proud of this because our organization was at the forefront, is that we've seen how patients have been recruited into research studies, and this has led to rapid advancements in knowledge. And as we know, we've seen the development of vaccines within hitherto very short timescales, which have not happened in the past. And that's been because everyone has tried to recruit as many patients into this as well as possible. I think that one of the challenges going forward is going to be, how do we ensure that we can strip away the organizational barriers across health and social care systems? And I'm thinking here, particularly how innovative practices in IT, which will allow clinical practice, if you think of artificial intelligence, how clinical practice can develop. And we know that artificial intelligence will also have an impact on middle management roles, as it were. I don't think we saw too much of this during the pandemic crisis mode, but I think that looking ahead, I think this will be a big issue. I think a global issue will be this question of grasping the nettle on antibiotic resistance, because I think that this could radically change what modern healthcare can offer. And I think can detrimentally also has a possibility of detrimentally affecting patient outcomes. And I think that one of the things that our clinicians were telling us was their concerns about these sorts of issues. And then I think the final long-term issue I'd like to raise is that what the pandemic has done is expose existing health inequalities in this country. And we've seen how people have linked this to different communities, for example, and people have said there is a clear link between ethnic origin, for example, and housing density. We know that population health can be affected by factors such as education, the housing environment, people's employment, their life opportunities. And I think the big and challenging question, not just for people like me within hospitals, but more widely, is what impact is this pandemic have over the next 5 or 10 years in terms of population health?
Thank you, Karamjit. Thank you. Quite rightly pointed out that it's almost a test of the entire system, from research to delivery to and it's impacted pretty badly the physical and the mental health. I mean, mental health issues are now surfacing as high priority. We haven't really paid too much attention to it. So one of the important, thank you. I'd like to turn to David now. So one of the issues throughout the year that's gone by has been how to ensure smooth supply chains. I mean, we thought that only in the Brexit context this discussion would be quite pertinent, but the pandemic's thrown a completely different set of challenges before us. We've never seen disruption like what the pandemic's presented before us. So in terms of the supply chains around the world, whether it is the vaccine rollout or actually just general materials, goods traveling between countries across borders, what must organizations do to prepare for, I suppose, the worst case scenario in the future? David.
Yeah, and I've been confronted to that as part of a startup deploying solutions around the world and having to contend with the disruption of the supply chain. And I think with every crisis, you have an opportunity to innovate and innovate in a way that doesn't only prepare you for the next crisis, but also improves the way things are done, even here and now. Because the problem we always have is, whilst we're in the middle of the crisis, it's all in our mind. But the danger is once you're over the crisis, people might forget and discount the risk of the future crisis. It's not like this. The risk of such a pandemic hadn't been called or flagged by many people, from Bill Gates to leading public health epidemiologists. But we didn't prepare for those. So I think what's really important is to, for industry to take the incentives to invest and make the changes that will be useful even outside pandemics. And when it comes to supply chain, one thing that has really come to the fore is the need for transparency and visibility and powerful analytics on the supply chain. More than 10 years ago, some industries, bodies had flagged the high costs and opportunity costs in creating better transparency in the healthcare supply chain. There's always been high rates of obsolescence, waste, and unaddressed risks by lack of visibility in the supply chain as products are stockpiled and go out of date and obsolete or misdistributed. So obviously one opportunity is to really implement at scale across the whole supply chain the standards that exist and the technologies that exist to track and trace items, whether they're at consignment level or even at an SKU level, when they're in a ward. Like I had a friend, who's a doctor at the NHS who was saying that they went during a shift without adequate PPE overnight, only to find out the next morning that the PPE was available, but just in a storage room a few doors away, but they had no way of knowing that. So, and that's, so you have maldistribution and misinformation about what's available in the supply chain, even at such a granular level of the last mile, which is something that's actually available, but just in a corridor, just two doors away, and people didn't use them because they didn't know. So that's a great opportunity to really deploy those solutions that are available and have been available. The standards have been available for the past 10 years. The technology is available to track and trace, and the analytics are available. And so that's one thing that we can all do, and combining innovation and investment at health system level, at a hospital level, from all of the providers of pharmaceutical and medical devices, and then the analytics to empower people to have the visibility and act on them. And of course, we could all wish, that we had crystal balls and better analytics to help us predict, things. But the most important thing is just making us more resilient, and making us resilient in investing in solutions that actually will make a difference right now, even outside of pandemics, in reducing waste and in actually deploying goods that we have today to people in the right way. And of course, then when crises and shocks happen, these investments are even more worthwhile. But we need to focus on investments that actually return even outside of the pandemic. The other innovations that I've seen, there's a startup in that's partly between Holland and New York that, and it's one of many startups of its kind, that we're investing in 3D printing of parts. And there are lots of examples of hospitals in France, for instance, that out of urgency ended up setting themselves up to 3D print parts of very important equipment, a piece of equipment such as ventilators, because obviously there are some consumable elements of these important equipment that you need to replace, etc. And so one other resilient response is to say, do we really need to be exposed to the need to ship things around the world and be at the mercy of a very important piece of equipment not being usable because we're missing a part or we're missing a consumable? And can we reduce our dependency by being able to 3D print those on demand where they're needed? And again, these are things that will be extremely useful in an emergency, but these can also add a lot of value in actually rethinking the supply chains and reducing the need to store and keep inventory of a lot of consumables and mobilize a lot of capital in inventory, and instead replacing that with on-demand printing of these, so supply chains. And I think the third dimension, which is how can we deploy solutions at scale across systems by being more interoperable? Because it's not only around the supply of vaccines and parts, it's also how can we spread innovation across health systems? A lot of people have invested in innovations such as advanced biosensors. That's an industry I'm very much involved in, or innovative apps, etc. The problem is to deploy them, they need to run on interoperable systems. They need to run on data that's exposed from a variety of data silos. So here, we also need at an industry level to enable platforms and have health systems invest in exposing their data and their systems via platforms, such as an innovation, whether it comes from a hospital in the NHS, a startup in Israel, or a pharmaco in Switzerland. These innovations, when they come up, are rapidly deployable across health systems without being slowed down by interoperability and data normalization issues.
I mean, data has become the new gold, hasn't it, David? It's almost like it's going to become such an important commodity. It already is. Thank you. And I mean, I suppose India recognized the importance of self-reliance, and the Honorable Prime Minister in India, launched this campaign called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means greater self-reliance and non-dependability, at least on the essential commodities. And so to be more self-reliant in terms of producing goods, so that you're not stuck in case there is no movement of goods for some time. And it's unprecedented. All of this is new experiences. We've never imagined there would be a time that from globalization you'd look at localization. So thank you very much, David. Now, the entire pressure has been almost, of course, on the delivery of healthcare systems. I'd like to turn to Professor Cheng for now. R&D has been UK's strength for, it's well known that UK has very, very strong R&D and research and abilities. But the COVID-19 itself has demonstrated that without the industry support, you cannot, go forward. So the academia and pharma partnership, and supported by industry, across the board, has almost led to that novel drug discovery. So what would you see as, the contours of this partnership, the academia-pharma or academia-industry partnership, Dr. Cheng?
As a public health doctor, on almost every international meeting like this since the beginning of the pandemic, I found myself being asked to reflect on the mistakes the UK has made that have resulted in the catastrophic outcomes of the UK. So I'm really relieved today that I'm asked to address a different question. Many of you are aware that India produces 60% of all vaccines in use in the world. On the question of academia-pharma partnership, it's difficult really to find better examples to illustrate the importance of this partnership than in vaccine developments in this pandemic. Before the pandemic, there's actually no major groups or academic groups or industry in the setting in the world actually that was seriously working on vaccines targeting any of the common coronaviruses. There are quite a few common circulating coronaviruses, but actually apart from the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus that I think Oxford group was working on, there are very, very few universities or in these sort of pharmaceutical companies that are interested in vaccines of coronaviruses. But we've seen in this pandemic how agile the academics and this academic pharmaceutical collaboration and have actually resulted, for example, in the two common vaccines used in the UK, the Oxford AstraZeneca one and the Pfizer BioNTech one. both actually represent some really very close collaboration between universities and the industry. The Oxford one sort of has almost becomes a household name in the UK now. So it's a workhorse of the vaccines program here, led by Sarah Gilbert and Andrew Pollard. They quickly turned to the design of a vaccine very soon after the genome was actually sequenced. By the way, actually the sequence was of the genome was actually done by a Chinese academic in Fudan University who actually sort of upload the sequence very soon in the pandemic, which allow all kinds of research and development, drug developments and diagnostic test developments to be done. The Pfizer-BioNTech one, the founders of BioNTech, Ugur Sahin, he's actually an oncologist, and he's a professor of oncology at the University of Mainz, and his interest has always been on this use of messenger RNA in the treatment of cancer. So again, actually, this agility that he knows, well, with the pandemic starting, that he and his group quickly turned their attention to developing a vaccine that we use, and is as they say, the rest was history. Really, it's millions and tens of millions of these two vaccines have been used in human population. I'm less familiar with the story behind the development of Covaxin, the Indian vaccine actually based on the inactivated virus produced by Bharat Biotech. However, I suspect there are probably similar collaborative efforts and agility that result in the successful production of this vaccine. There are other examples of successes in other interventions related to COVID, for example, on antiviral treatment or immunological treatments, and also in development of rapid diagnostic tests, which would not have been possible without close links between academia and the industry. Another example just announced today, actually, is a multi-million-pound research program funded by the UK Research and Innovations, the research agency of Research Council of the UK, that actually allow my colleagues at University of Birmingham to study long COVID. It was just announced this morning. At the heart of the study will be the use of a digital platform developed by Apparito, a medtech company. They're planning to use to assess self-reported outcomes, symptoms, quality of life, and work capability, and to conduct a trial on an intervention tailored to individual patient need on a digital platform. So these are really examples that are within the pandemic, where really people quickly turn their attention and to trying to tackle important problems like this.
Thank you, Professor Cheng. It's quite right. I mean, collaboration, more collaboration, and looking ahead is the way forward. Now, one thing that we all have been perhaps forced into is almost like a digital life. I mean, we are communicating right now over a digital platform. So I'd like to turn to Roshan. The significance of digital tools, application of technology, one had heard of AI capabilities and all of that. I mean, who knew we'd be stuck in a box, Roshan? So what you see are the future contours of healthcare, and what lies ahead in terms of virtual healthcare. I mean, a few months back, if you had, said virtual healthcare, it perhaps wouldn't make much sense to people. But increasingly, people are beginning to realize that there is every reason why we must have a robust, technology enabled healthcare system. Roshan, what are your response to that?
I think it's a great question, Lakshmi, and thank you for actually asking me to kind of address that. If I actually just take a step back, before the pandemic actually hit us, you had actually the industry looking at clinical trials, but more from a novel exploratory basis, not really kind of looking at it from a perspective that it will be the new norm. If you look at things like the remote detailing, which was actually happening along with the doctors, it was again considered to be something that was being explored. I think the pandemic has actually brought forward that these virtual kind of means have become the way of actually leading the life in years to come, and I think the foreseeable future, according to me. If you look at actually also the examples that happened during the pandemic, the virtual consultations that actually happened. So the NHS GPs were interfacing with their patients through the virtual consultation, offering them kind of measures to take care of actually their health, their well-being, prescriptions being actually given to them online, So the virtual consultation became really kind of the truth which was there. The remote care management, there was also actually kind of remote care management being offered by the healthcare systems to the consumers and the patients. Uh, the advent of actually the EPROC, which is the electronic patient record outcome management, which is again gaining a lot of momentum now. I think people who are in the industry will know that a typical clinical trial takes actually the person to be uh, at the hospital about 12 to 13 times during the clinical trial across a period of time. And typically you would actually kind of go to the hospital to get a medicine or get injected with certain things just 2 or 3 times, and the remaining times it's more about actually kind of visiting to convey to the physicians about how you're feeling, what are the effects of actually the medication that was taken. If you look at organizations like Mobile Health now, which Infosys is actually also working with them, they've created a platform, a digital platform called as Concilium Care. Now, this is specific to the oncology patients, where the patients can actually talk about how they feel and communicate to the care systems almost instantaneously without actually kind of needing to go towards the hospitals. This also actually reduces a lot of cost, which actually is there in the healthcare systems, because on an average, we actually see the health care cost actually increase by about 5 to 6% every year. So all these measures and interventions are actually going to help in terms of reducing the cost, but also getting more kind of better care towards actually the consumers. Technology is also playing an important role from the perspective of the adoption of cloud. Now, if you look at it, the global healthcare cloud consumption, studies actually have shown that they will grow up to about 11.8% by 2026. Which means that the adoption of cloud within the healthcare systems is becoming the way things will actually happen in the future. And I do actually see the need for that, because the healthcare systems are actually trying to get all clinically integrated networks now. And that can actually happen with the cloud enabling that. You look at actually data, I think some of my esteemed colleagues were talking about data. The digitization of actually data on cloud is going to actually bring avenues of better care systems towards actually the consumers. And it's not just the clinical kind of applications and systems, but even the non-clinical. If you look at the revenue cycle management, if you look at the financial management, or you look at actually uh, the uh, the the exchange of actually health information that is actually required, all this can actually be enabled through cloud. So I do actually see a dominance of actually both the digital tools as well as technology playing an important role. And absolutely, the virtual healthcare is actually there to stay, according to me.
Thank you, Roshan. And it's so vitally important for outreach in terms of healthcare provisioning for wider community, and so that's quite helpful. And I'm actually going to turn to Dr. Kapil Yadav, who is with the Center for Community Medicine at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Very large hospital, very prominent hospital, very busy hospital as well, and a great research facility in India, almost a place of pride for all of us currently. Um, the centralized records, the e-patients, everything aside, but nothing is right now coming in the way of. So the future of clinical trials is what I want to talk to you about. Just yesterday on the news, we heard that in the UK there are volunteers now putting themselves forward, getting inducted, induced by the infection, to see how much it infects. So one knows that there is no competition, or no, it's almost unparalleled amount of information or revelation that clinical trials will bring. So, what do you see? Would the COVID-19 catalyze almost like the future of clinical trials? Dr. Yadav, your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. And at the outset, I'd like to thank Infosys, CII, and the Consulate Journal of Birmingham for having me here. Uh, basically, I would be elaborating on the question you've asked on 3 points. First is the awareness around science, awareness around evidence-based medicine, awareness around clinical trials that has increased exponentially during the COVID time. Second component, other people have touched what is known as telescoping of clinical trials. The traditional period that we associated with clinical trial has been shortened significantly in corona times or COVID times because of various exigencies. Third part also speakers prior to me have addressed, that is a decentralized trial, newer mode of having trials. We are innovating as we are going along. So the most significant and most heartening development for me as a researcher, as a public health specialist, has been that the awareness around clinical trials. What I said, you said AIIMS is one of the biggest hospital. So most of the time we were engaged in clinical trials. But when COVID challenged us, we were forced to step back a bit and take a stock that science still has a lot of unknowns. And the way forward of addressing these unknowns is primarily clinical trials or the evidence-based medicine. And I realized that it's very good or exciting time to be epidemiologist in these era. A lot of learning, a lot of discussions are going around clinical trials, and if you interact with common people, they would be even now aware about what is phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four trials. So overall, this churning has made what I my personal belief is made our community at large more scientific. They are willing to look at science in a more critical perspective. So that is where I think we have a good future ahead as far as clinical trials is concerned. The next component is telescoping. The traditional period associated with trials was 2 to 3 years. For vaccine, it was even a longer period of a decade or so. But we did realize that if required, the system should be able to do it in a much shorter period, maintaining the optimal, adequate scientific rigor and checks and balances. So I think that also I see as a heartening development. There have been some pitfalls, some shortcuts were taken by a few players, but I think we have systems and checks in place where these were taken care of. So that is also it's very good for overall scientific research in India. Decentralized trials, I think, will be the mode for future, whereas Roshan prior to me mentioned that actual contact with a patient and a researcher or a trial team might be required only once or twice. Other times it can be done through remote, through telemedicine or using AIs. So that development can be overall heartening. In Indian context, one of the very exciting personal revelation for me was use of clinical trials in Indian system of medicine. That happened in Corona. We have been striving for that, but once the discussion around science started, so even the traditional systems of medicine came forward and they said, we are willing to. So I saw it a two-way process. Our system also refined and evolved ourselves. We looked back and thought, because if you see in early part of Corona pandemic, a lot of interventions were subsequently after they went through the various phases of clinical trials, most often than not, some of these interventions were dropped, and that was primarily because of the rigor of the clinical trial and the high level of scrutiny these trials were under. So overall, I am very happy that focus that Corona has brought on science and evidence-based medicine, especially the clinical trial, as being what is the holy grail of science, or maybe the gold standard for any scientific innovation and scientific proof. Thank you.
Thank you. And these standards will keep evolving because, we want to be the best, globally. And what a shared learning, quite rightly pointed out, Dr. Yadav, that, the whole world has become one large university. Everybody's learning from each other. And of course, it's almost science-based decision making, even at the political, top sort of political levels. Thank you, Dr. Yadav. Now, taking the discussion forward, I'd like to come back to Karamjit. From a healthcare provider perspective, we've heard from Dr. Yadav on the clinical trials, importance of it and how it has, the reduced times and things like that. But what is the future of healthcare from a provider perspective, Karamjit?
That's a very interesting question, which could take a very long time to answer, but I will try and do it. I think the future of healthcare has to be that we try and provide healthcare as near to the patient as possible. So ideally, we must start with what can we do with people in their own home context and actually supporting them there. Then I think there's the issue of people's exposure to healthcare in a community setting, in terms of a primary care setting, and really people should be coming into provider hospitals really when they have morbidities, comorbidities, which require intervention, either in the form of an operation or some other intensive intervention. Now, that is the theory. The challenge we have is that, if you look at the UK NHS system, we have something like 10% of our expenditure, of NHS expenditure, goes on the primary care system. And yet, well over 90% of our patient interaction with clinicians is at the primary care level. So we have provider trusts, such as mine, and we have, our turnover is £1 billion a year, sterling a year. So we are employing 16,500 people. I would not suggest for any moment that the intervention we're making is not a worthwhile one in terms of population health. But population health management globally has to focus on, I think, has to be very much on communities. So coming back to the next question, the question then is, what do you need to do? We are now moving in the UK towards the concept of integrated care systems. And what this will require is a partnership between provider hospitals, between community-based organizations, between primary care organizations. And really what it is saying is that big provider organizations such as mine cannot be islands in the community. We have to work cooperatively with our patients. And I was just listening to, obviously, Dr. Kapil Yadav's comments with great interest, because I think if we're talking about community medicine, that is the way this can happen. I mean, if you think of a country like India, which has, so much of its population in rural communities. I know when I visit India, you see the challenge of having provider trusts, big hospitals sited in the big cities, and of course they should be. The question then is, how do we make sure those facilities are there for rural communities as well? And this is the sort of challenge we have here in the UK to a much smaller extent. So therefore, my response to this is that we need to have new mindsets of thinking. I think that there are opportunities. I think particularly IT must give virtual. I mean, one of the things coming from the pandemic is how we are all, as you say, in our own little boxes, communicating visually through new communication technologies, or maybe even old communication technologies. The important thing is that we need to carry on innovating. We have to also think about efficiency of the resources we have. How do we make the best use of the resources? We also have to think about the fact that it is a global challenge, that the clinical workforce globally is in demand, whether it's doctors or nurses or other allied health professionals. So the question then becomes, how do we effectively use that human resources? And for me, the very final thing is again, the point that Dr. Yadav was touching about, is actually how do we make the patients better informed about the treatment, ask the right questions about the treatment they will receive in provider organizations, as well as earlier stages of the healthcare process.
Quite right. I mean, and the challenges are manifold, aren't they? I mean, we don't know what the future looks like, so we have to be prepared and ready. Now, I mean, coming back to the, thank you very much, Karamjit. I'd like to come to Dr. Shashank Vikram. You know, because we're referring to the UK-India corridor, Dr. Vikram, I mean, and international relations, we're still coping. So how to cope better for the future, of similar situations or perhaps worse situations, in future, who knows? How can we strengthen international relations for future, Dr. Vikram?
Well, thank you. I would like to say, you see, one of the most important thing is that we need to first recalibrate our priorities. And I think when it comes to, and when I say recalibrate the priorities, you see, when you see this century, and I would say like we are in 21st, but you can take it from 20th century to 21st century, the globalization has taken place at a great speed on those sectors where we felt that, there is the need. When we felt it, like telecommunication, you can call anywhere to anywhere. Or, or in case of the way in which, that these IT has developed, computers have come up, we all use it across the world, So it is not something which you have to actually work for it, but the fact is you should have the need and the intention to go for it. And since it is for the first time in our generation, or I would say in the living memory, that we have such a pandemic. So while it is a grim scenario when it comes to the disease, and we have been moving out of it now. But it's also a time which basically calls for people to recalibrate their priorities, peoples and countries and systems, I would say. See, there's one thing when we talk about specifically if I talk about the collaboration in the health sector or health systems. So system is, in my view, it is not something which is separate. There are components of the system. Human capital is a very important component, and it is the technology which is a very important component. And when it comes to the medical sciences, right from the basic research about the disease progression, then to diagnostics, then to treatment protocols, then the different technologies which are used firstly for individual patient, then for managing the hospitals and the health systems. Those all have to be would have to start talking to each other. Today, one thing which I don't know, those in India, we call the modern medicine is generally referred as allopathic medicine. Now, what happened with allopathic medicine was with that you got a modern system of medicine which is today practiced more or less in every country in the world. So that is why it's easy for a doctor trained in India to come to UK and work after training in India, and same vice versa. So you have achieved that. You need to achieve same kind of seamless movement of technology. And as I said, it can never be that some people are deprived of it. A world where, a person like you and me who happen to be in a place which has all facilities, and we are getting, cutting edge tests done for maybe our little problems. And then there is an issue where somebody is running around to have a simple X-ray. So you can't have that situation. So that is why I think, and if it requires, as we see, as this was the first challenge, so I think it also brings into the focus to the reforms in the international institutes which are governing the health today. There are so many multilateral bodies which are looking at the health scenario. So I think there is a need for them also to sit back and see what is the learning curve there, how all the members on all the states can have, if they have the same challenge, they should also have the same opportunities or the tools to combat the situation when it comes. And in this regard, I would say, just like any relationship, first you should have the intention, and then you have to build trust in it. So I can say about India, from the very beginning of the disease, India has repeatedly shown its interest. And we have, if you can say, we have actually, in spite of being a country which is a developing country with, with a large population, we have actually emerged as the net, I would say, health security provider to the world. Whether it was medicine, whether it was vaccination, whether it was combating the disease in India itself. Today, we have one of the best recovery rates in the world. Today, India has come out of the disease. It is true that we went into one of the most early lockdowns, and also, we also had a very early ban on air travel when people were still thinking whether they should do it or not. But the fact is those things worked. And those things worked. They also gave us time to prepare. We also simultaneously, government worked on packages to be provided to the poor. Like there was this Pradhan Mantri, I think, Garib Kalyan Yojana, under which the ration was given. Similarly, economic stimulus was given. Many countries did all these things also. But we also went all the way around, and there are success stories like these in other countries also. So now the time is to collaborate it. One is to, of course, just we have to develop a protocol, how to treat, how to diagnose, treat, and the disease itself. But we also have to bring this complementarity of systems, because the virus is not treating you unequally. So you can't have the unequal treatment of the virus too. So that is what I would like to say.
It's absolutely non-discriminatory. Unfortunately, it doesn't see rich and poor when it's, when it's impacting you. And unfortunately, also not age. One thought that at one point data sets came in that only the more mature age group are going to get affected. But then we have seen very, very close to all of us, some young people have lost their lives owing to the pandemic. And it's quite tragic. I mean, it's a huge tragedy. We hope we come out of it very soon and come out much stronger. Thank you, Dr. Vikram. I'll turn to Professor Cheng. We've talked about international collaborations and how to better collaborate. I mean, again, between the academia, the governments, and the healthcare, almost like a public-private partnership across the healthcare value chain, medtech, hospitals, IT organizations. Dr. Vikram talked about all of this. How will research play a key role in future to avoid a situation like what we are in currently, Professor Cheng?
I think nothing really enhances the collaborative spirits of people, organizations like a pandemic. I'm fortunate enough not having to go through a major war, but I guess the readiness of people to work together in war efforts may well be similar to what we are witnessing in how we deal with this pandemic. And we actually see collaborations at every level. And it would be really important we try to build on this kind of spirit in the post-pandemic world. As I said, there are many levels of collaboration between governments. Under auspices of the WHO, there are many things that really governments and countries really need to work together on public health measures, on border controls, and so on. Between government, academia, and pharma, really we talk about in many countries, for example, in UK, rapid injection funding for research into things like vaccines and expediting and smoothing the processes for clinical trials. For example, the ones that Dr. Yadav mentioned. And in the UK, we've got this wonderful platform called Recovery, which has tested a number of drugs that dexamethasone and one of the anti-rheumatic drugs that seem to have to be very effective in COVID. And the WHO has coordinated these solidarity trials, which are recruiting massive number of patients all over the world. Between universities, lots of exciting research projects are looking at various aspects of COVID are happening. In the UK, National Institute for Health Research has in the last over 10 years actually engendered a major this of culture to make people work together to tackle important questions. And I hope this kind of practice actually gets reflected in other parts of the world where these spirits sometimes don't exist. Between farmers, we have seen some wonderful examples of collaboration. Actually, there are some companies which have failed to get their candidate vaccines to advanced testing and approval. They've lent their manufacturing capacity. For example, I think Novartis or Sanofi have lent the manufacturing capacity to Moderna and Pfizer to produce their vaccines. And these are things which are previously you wouldn't have dreamed of happening. And then between academia and the public, again, Dr. Yadav mentioned this increased awareness of clinical trials. I think important for us to capitalize on this awareness to improve recruitment to trials and to improve quality of clinical trials. In childhood cancer, for example, over 70% of, actually it's probably close to 80% of newly diagnosed childhood cancer patients in this country get randomized into clinical trials. It really doesn't seem to happen in other countries or in other clinical areas, even in this country. So this needs really the public to understand the importance of clinical trials, to understand the rationale behind clinical trials. After the pandemic, in medicine and drug discovery, I would like to mention two particular areas where we can do a strong partnership between government, academia, and pharma. The first one is new antibiotics. And given the serious threat from antibiotic resistance, there are actually surprisingly few antibiotics being developed by pharmaceutical companies. So special incentives and investment from national governments were introduced. There's some initiative in the US and some in the EU as well. And another area of importance is drugs for use in pregnancy, for which there have only been a handful of new products, especially for problems in pregnancy that was developed in the last 2 decades. And drug companies are hesitant to venture into this area because of liability and indemnity issues in testing new investigational medicinal products. So really, these are the type of things that, well, really, I hope in the post-pandemic situation, there'd be more collaboration that will allow us to move forward.
Absolutely. And, and there are no alternates right now. We have what we have. I mean, there have been a few cases of allergic reactions to the vaccine as well. And, there is no response. There is no alternate just yet. And that's why it's so important to constantly innovate and sort of, research. Thank you to Professor Cheng. I'll actually turn to Dr. Kapil Yadav. One has talked about disruption on the supply chain, but the disruption in terms of R&D isn't very much talked about. We watch, R&D updates pretty much every day, press conferences, news updates on how research is quickly trying to find answers to certain unfound, responses to questions. But my question to you simply is this: how severely has the pandemic disrupted the pharma and the medtech R&D, Dr. Yadav?
Lakshmi, when you're putting this question to me, I see it in a two-way. Disruption can be negative also, or current generation's terminology, it's a positive term also. So though our traditional understanding would say that pharma R&D, medtech research and R&D was disrupted by COVID pandemic in early phases because of difficulty in enrolling patients, problem of treatment continuity, delays in trial assessment, protocol adherence, decreased patient visits, and all, and that all of us were aware. But I see this as more as a positive disruption, primarily because of two reasons. First, it brought about the scientific R&D community together. Whole of the world, at least for corona-related interventions, worked as one community. Something happening in USA, mRNA vaccine coming out of Pfizer and Moderna, and mRNA vaccine coming out of India also. So that whole bridge, that spectrum was much closer. So that was one aspect. The whole world functioned as one scientific community, and that's the way the science should be. More advanced nature should be, say, sharing information with the less advanced nation. Second component that was very positive was the transparency that this disruption caused. Because of such high stakes for humanity as a whole in COVID research and R&D, all scientific researchers were forced to be upfront very transparent. For the first time, the protocols of the vaccines were put in public domain, because stakes were not only economical, but humanity's existence was at stake. So that transparency was overwhelming for most of us, and whether we like it or not, we scientists are very opaque people. We think what we do is the right and we don't want to share it with other people. But Corona forced us to do it. It was a thing. I think there is still more scope for increasing this transparency, being more upfront about it, because science is nothing if it is not honest. These were the two positive disruptions I saw from Corona pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, it hints at the importance of data sharing and collaboration. Ultimately, you are referring to indirectly or directly how certain learnings are going to feed to global response to a situation like this, so much worse in the future. I'd like to turn to Roshan. Innovations in healthcare. They bring in efficiency in health outcomes. We've talked about integration of technology in the health care sector, whether it is the med tech or almost like a virtual healthcare system, and also the pharmaceutical industries. How does innovation bring about efficiency, healthcare in health outcomes? Roshan.
I think, Lakshmi, I can give a few examples to kind of get the point across, and that might be the best way. So, if you look at actually all the wearable technologies that we actually have, whether it's the Fitbit to actually other things, all these wearable technologies now are actually kind of integrated along with the mainstream kind of medical devices, so that the inputs of whatever is actually happening within you as an individual goes across to those systems, and then they can actually kind of provide the relevant care. But I think one very interesting example of innovation is, I don't know how many of the audience as well as my esteemed members know, there's an organization that has actually come up with this handheld device which is called as Butterfly IQ. We are used to actually seeing doctors with having the stethoscope. So it seems like the stethoscopes will be actually outdated, and Butterfly IQ will be the new norm. And it just doesn't actually do the things that typically a stethoscope used to do, but it actually goes far beyond. It actually is able to kind of give you real-time kind of images of how your heart is actually functioning or your liver is functioning. So the images are actually kind of conveyed across directly to your iPhone. So you can connect it to your iPhone and actually kind of get all those readings. If you have a muscular pain, it can actually kind of have a look at actually that area. It shows you the image, and you can actually kind of take precautions, or you can actually take the diagnosis based on that. So it's very interesting in terms of how innovation is actually coming in. If you look at actually technology organizations like Infosys, we are investing along with technology partners like SAP in terms of coming up with personalized medicine solutions, because we are actually seeing that personalized medicine is going to be relevant in the future. It's not going to be about what is the medicine that is actually good for the masses, but it's actually about what is relevant and good for you as an individual. And lastly, I would actually say that again, the technology organizations are trying to bring in innovations by actually kind of collaborating with organizations that are working in the medtech. So Kaleidoscope is a recent acquisition that Infosys did. Now, Kaleidoscope are specialized in actually designing equipments for surgical kind of operations, as well as actually kind of devices to kind of have drugs induced into the body of individuals. Now we are bringing the best of both, that is actually leveraging their capabilities on the user experience, the human factor part, compounding it with the technology capability that we have in terms of bringing innovative solutions into the healthcare industry. So I think those are the examples that actually kind of convey the point in terms of how innovation is going to create an impact, both on the medtech side as well as in the overall healthcare paradigm.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you very much. I'd like to just call out to the audience to, if you have any questions, now's your chance. Coming to David, I'm actually going to club one of the questions that we received for you from Dr. Dylan Wills from the Great Ormond Street Hospital. He's saying that, earlier on when you spoke, you talked about how many innovations have come to light during the pandemic, trying to respond, and will continue to be valuable as we emerge and return to more normal activities, whatever, if we ever return to a normal life. He's saying the infrastructure, processes, and skill development will certainly be very valuable. His question is that how can we continue to keep the momentum and lead into further innovations? And I also wanted to ask you your perspective on better collaboration between pharma and healthcare industries. We've heard various, combinations of how this collaboration is going to work. But in terms of the innovation space, as well as, better collaboration between pharma and healthcare in delivering these healthcare facilities. David.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I think it's a wonderful question because I think as much as we can talk about the what of innovation, what's even more important is the how and how we continue to sustain the innovation. There's a lot of innovation potential coming from frontline people. Not only the carers who are the frontline of identifying opportunities to improve, but also patients and informal carers themselves. And how can we unleash that innovation potential? And I've been very close to some of the people who are leading in the UK, the NHS's Digital Health Academy. And one of the things I've been advocating for many, many years is to not only engage clinicians and teach people to understand technology better, but to really infuse a service design capability in the whole healthcare ecosystem so that people can be more adept at designing technology into people's lives, as opposed to just deploying technology onto people. And there's some wonderful examples in the UK, whether it's Professor George Cook's Digital Health and Care Institute in Scotland, who has many service designers as part of his team. It's not only technology people. He's got architects, textile designers, fashion designers, who actually know how to design things into people's lives to make them more sustainable. Because at the end of the day, you want the technology to be easy to adopt by people on the front line, whether it's a patient, a nurse, a doctor, etc. So service design is a skill that's, I think, underexploited. You had other great examples at Imperial St. Mary's, where Ara Darzi had set up the Helix Center, etc. So there's lots of service design capabilities. And actually, the UK has had a long tradition in excellence in design, in product design and service design. And so, health and social care should, make, more use of that academic and also just talent. The other thing I think that sustains innovation is commercial design. So how do we design not only the technologies and the innovations, but how do we also align the incentives and the economic models so that doing the right thing is also the sustainable economic thing for every stakeholder to do? Because we all know, and we've all been frustrated, anyone who's been working in healthcare for a long time, a lot of things that ought to be done don't get done for lack of the right alignment of incentives and funding, etc. We talk about prevention for a long time, but a lot of things that are worth doing or worthwhile don't get done. And it's often because people lack the commercial insights into how do I re-arbitrage between people's risks and people's rewards, because in healthcare, risks and rewards are often very imperfectly distributed between the people who use, the people who benefit, the people who pay, the people who prescribe, the people who regulate, etc. There's so many stakeholders that it's very easy for one stakeholder to be bearing a lot of cost and risk and effort and being promised jam tomorrow. And as a result, the whole system doesn't benefit because one stakeholder doesn't participate. So I think that's that's a really key factor. So we really need to focus as much as innovating on the how as the what. And to your question, actually, on the what, I'll just quickly flag three things that I think have been accelerated or emphasized by the pandemic, in particular in terms of health and pharma collaboration. One is shifting care into the home. The second is shifting from a perception of patient insights to whole person insights. And the third is shifting to open data collaboration. On the first one thing that's been exposed by the pandemic is the risk of isolation. People, the most vulnerable people, often have been told that it was safer for them to shelter in their homes. But as a result, they've been out of sight. And there've been gaps have emerged in their care plans. They haven't adhered as much to their checkups. They might have had diabetes or other chronic conditions, but then they deteriorate unseen. And while it's great that everybody's using Zoom and virtual health, we still have a limited capacity of doctors. Even if it's virtual, doctors have a finite amount of time, and nurses have a finite amount of time, and there's a shortage of nurses. So the fact that it's virtual doesn't necessarily help. So that's where there's a lot of innovation that I see happening, where pharmaceutical companies are going beyond their traditional therapies and combining them with digital therapeutics, whether it's a digital CBT for mental health therapies, or AR and VR enabled educational tools, or whether it's using ambient sensors to be able to continuously monitor someone's health in the home and engage with them and their care team. So that's the one thing, shifting care into the home. The second is shifting the focus on patient insights to people insights. We've talked about precision medicine and knowing a lot about people as their bodies and their microbiomes and genomes, etc., and to be ever more precise about what they need in terms of prescribed therapies, etc. What we're still relatively clueless about is what shifts influences their behavior. And one thing that we've seen a lot is the challenge of this pandemic is how do we get the right information to people? How do we influence people to come forward and get themselves vaccinated, to wear masks, to follow public health guidance? And there are a lot of insights about actually how do we drive better understanding and actually partner also with the consumer industries to really truly understand how do we incentivize people and how to influence people's behaviors so that not only they get vaccinated for this vaccine, but also for any vaccine. We've had issues with actually people not vaccinating their kids for measles, etc., and that's been a problem. So how do we use insights about people's behaviors to also help influence them into healthier lifestyles, better adherence to their care plans, etc. And the third aspect we've seen much more collaboration about, and that's been mentioned several times by the other panelists, is open data and collaboration on data. And I think that's where you have a lot of innovations that are possible around making not only new models of research on therapy development and drug development, but also making data available to innovate also on the commercial model to create better access to drugs. Like a friend of mine has a startup that's opening up data platforms to allow commercial model innovations to allow oncology drugs to be accessed by greater populations, for instance, in India, where on current commercial models, they may not be affordable. But you need the data to be available and open for win-win-win relationships to emerge between the payers, whether public or out of pocket or private, the pharmaceutical industries and the provider organizations. But they need data to be available on open and collaborative platforms.
Thank you. I mean, very, very good points that you highlighted, David. Thank you. And it could almost be summarized as the crux of what we are discussing today in that manner. I will just quickly turn to Dr. Shashank Vikram quickly because we're running out of time fairly swiftly. There is a question for you, Dr. Vikram, from Shohel Ghosh. He's asking, is there a missing link which specifically needs to be focused upon to improve care delivery? Just very quick, maybe top sort of response to that. This is a question from Shohel Ghosh from the audience, Dr. Vikram.
Oh, thank you so much for the question. And, when you talk about missing links, being a student of biology, I actually remember some links. So, well, I would say, see, the missing link is, as earlier, I think Dr. Karamjit and as well as Dr. Yadav mentioned, at the end of the day, it is about the people. It is about the communities, whether it is here in UK or in India or any other part of the world. Now, like we were earlier, Roshan was referring to the virtual healthcare. Now, we might have come a long way, but virtual healthcare are one of the modes by which you take the delivery to the people who need it. Now, what we need is we need the ways to bridge this gap between the cutting edge technology and between the people in need. with a way in which you have to have a way where the innovator or the company also gets the benefit of what research and whatever things they have put in, without putting overburden on an individual himself because he is consuming a service. It is the same thing as, I think as David was also saying that, the cost and the benefit analysis of it should not be done at a micro level. You have to see that if there is a need when it comes to health systems, then the system should be able to provide that need to the person who needs it. And what is the most conducive way of going about it? And there are many ways. Today also, when we see at the word, there is an unequal word around us. And when we see that, but what this pandemic, as we discussed in the beginning, has shown us that we may not be that disconnected as we want to assume we are. All of us, we have come to, in different societies, we have now come to a place where we may not know the name of our neighbor, but perfectly speaking, that makes no effect to the virus or things like this, which are common. So because the common, we have a common challenge. We are standing on 21st century. Today, we may not have anticipated COVID-19 before, but the fact is that science has come a long way. The word has come a long way. And today, this word has enough. If we have, as we were discussing earlier, if we have the trust and the willingness. And, I once again go back to the Vasudev Kutumbakam, but the fact is that if you consider it like that, then it will help. It will help in bridging the missing link. So if you ask me, the only missing link in the whole thing is our ability to understand and recognize that we are one at the end, and a problem of one is problem of everyone. So any solution has to be sustainable.
Thank you. Very, very beautifully put. And I think India is sort of led in that example, whether you have a smartphone or not doesn't matter. And there's a question from Greg Rivers asking how to ensure access to those who do not have smartphones. I suppose India is a good example of that, because we do facilitate healthcare delivery to the remotest of, corners of India. Greg, you must travel to India to understand this better. Next time,
Yes,
come over.
we are undertaking the largest vaccination in history, so it is a good time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That has been quite an insightful discussion. I will actually now request Roshan to offer his closing remarks and perhaps summarize and offer a note of thanks to all our panelists and audience. Roshan.
First of all, on behalf of actually Infosys, the Consul General, and the CII, I would like to thank all the esteemed panel members who joined us on this discussion, because it was a real honor and a pleasure to kind of hear the views coming from different perspectives, but very relevant in the context of actually what we were discussing about the post-pandemic kind of a scenario. So thank you once again to all the panel members. Thank you to the audience for actually kind of staying in and listening. I know that 90 minutes could actually be a long duration at times, but I think to do justice to all the perspectives that we wanted to get across from the government perspective, from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, from the hospital side, from the consumer side, it was important for us to actually kind of have this time allocated. I'm sure that you would have actually got a lot of insights from this discussion, and you would actually kind of help work along with us in order to kind of make a better ecosystem in the healthcare industry. I know there have been some questions that have actually come which we have not been able to address in this session. We will ensure that we will actually send across the responses to you all to those questions. So thank you for actually sending those in. Lakshmi, back to you.
Thank you so much. Now, in the new normal, the way to take a picture is slightly different. So if I could request all our panelists to switch on their cameras so that we can at least do a group picture virtually. This is the new normal. And I think our audience would like to see all of us together in one platform. Please, if I could request all of you to switch on your cameras so that our colleagues can take a picture. And I'm waiting for them to give me a cue when they've done the picture. There is no way to tell. And while we're doing that, I'd like to just say a frontline workers, all the healthcare professionals, all the technologists, everybody who's played a very, very important part, whether it is the governments, whether it is the civil society, it is communities. They played such an important role in not just responding to the pandemic, but also overcoming it, hopefully, and coming out stronger. Well, I just like to say stay well, stay healthy, and stay fit. And just want to say a big, big thank you to everyone. And we hope to come together to discuss more such topics. Roshan, many, many thanks to you for your leadership, and Dr. Vikram for your guidance and support as well. Once again, a special thanks to the Consulate General of India, Dr. Vikram, you especially, and Roshan, you and Infosys. On behalf of CII, big thank you to all of you. Stay well, travel home safe if you're traveling. If you're staying at home, enjoy your evening. Thank you.